Good evening. Welcome back to Whispered History. Tonight we are going to travel deep into the medieval world, a world of stone castles, winding pilgrimage roads, distant kingdoms, candlelit chapels, and battlefields stretching across the Holy Land. And at the center of our story stands one of the most mysterious military orders in history, the Knights Templar. For nearly 2 centuries, they stood between legend and reality. They were warriors, pilgrims, monks, bankers, castle builders, and servants of a cause that connected Europe to the distant lands of Jerusalem. Their story begins not in a secret underground chamber and not with hidden treasure, but with a dangerous road, a road leading from the ports and cities of Europe toward Jerusalem. After the First Crusade captured Jerusalem in 1099, thousands of Christian pilgrims began traveling toward the Holy Land. For these travelers, the journey was long and uncertain. Ships crossed the Mediterranean. Caravans moved through dry landscapes. Pilgrims walked along ancient roads. And beyond the safety of fortified towns, danger could appear suddenly. Bandits could attack, political conflicts could close roads, and travelers unfamiliar with the region could easily become vulnerable. Jerusalem was now in Christian hands, but holding the city was very different from capturing it. The Crusader states needed soldiers. They needed fortifications. They needed supplies. And they needed people willing to remain in a distant land surrounded by powerful neighbors. It was within this uncertain world that a small group of knights began forming an unusual brotherhood. Before we enter their story, take a moment to settle in, let the lights grow dim, put your phone aside if you can, and allow yourself to slowly step away from the modern world. If you enjoy peaceful journeys through history, please like, comment, and subscribe to Whispered History. Your support helps us continue creating long-form historical stories that you can relax to, learn from, or simply fall asleep listening to. And if you're listening tonight as you drift towards sleep, you don't need to remember every name. You don't need to remember every date. Just let the story unfold. Because tonight, we are traveling back to the beginning of the Knights Templar. The year is around 1119. Jerusalem is still relatively young as a Crusader kingdom. The walls of the city rise above the surrounding landscape. Pilgrims move through its streets. Merchants sell goods from distant lands. Latin, Arabic, Greek, and other languages can be heard among the crowds. The city is a meeting place of religions, cultures, armies, and ambitions. And somewhere within this world, a small group of knights is beginning to imagine something new. Their leader is a French knight named Hugues de Payan. He is not yet the Grand Master of one of the most famous military orders in history. There is no enormous Templar fleet, no network of castles, no great wealth, no legendary treasure. There are only a few men and an idea. They will dedicate themselves to protecting pilgrims traveling toward Jerusalem, but there is something unusual about their commitment. They are knights, yet they also intend to live as religious men. They will combine the life of a warrior with the discipline of a monk. They will pray. They will follow rules. They will live under vows, and they will fight when necessary. It is a strange combination. The medieval world already knew monks. It already knew knights. But a permanent religious brotherhood of heavily armed warriors was something different. At first, their numbers were small. Tradition remembers 9 original companions, although the exact early history is difficult to reconstruct. They lived modestly. They had limited resources. They depended on support from the Christian rulers and nobles around them, and they needed recognition. Without official approval from the church, their experiment could easily disappear. Their early headquarters were associated with the area of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The location was enormously symbolic. The Temple Mount was one of the most important religious sites in the world. For Christians, Jews, and Muslims, Jerusalem carried profound spiritual meaning. The Templars would eventually take their name from this connection. They became known as the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Over time, people would simply call them the Knights Templar. But in these early years, there was nothing inevitable about their future. They were a small brotherhood. They had no idea that they would eventually control castles across the Mediterranean. They could not know that kings would trust them with enormous sums of money. They could not imagine that their name would become associated centuries later with secret societies, hidden treasure, and mysterious conspiracies. They were simply trying to survive. And survival in the medieval Holy Land was not easy. The Crusader states were surrounded by powerful Muslim rulers. The capture of Jerusalem had not ended the conflict. It had created a new political reality. Christian armies held Jerusalem. They controlled territories along the eastern Mediterranean, but their enemies remained. Muslim rulers were divided among different states and dynasties. Yet the political balance could change quickly. A city could change hands. A castle could be surrounded. A road could become dangerous. And every settlement required protection. The Templars therefore found themselves in a world where military skill and religious devotion could exist side by side. Their lives were structured around discipline. They prayed at set times. They followed rules governing clothing, food, possessions, and behavior. Personal luxury was discouraged. Their identity was supposed to belong to the order rather than to themselves. A Templar knight was expected to obey. He was expected to remain disciplined. And when called upon, he was expected to fight. Their white mantles would eventually become famous. The red cross associated with the order would become one of the most recognizable symbols of the medieval Crusades, but those symbols came later. In the beginning, the Templars were still finding their place. They needed patrons. They needed land. They needed money. They needed recruits. And most importantly, they needed the approval of the church. That approval would come through one of the most influential religious figures of the 12th century. His name was Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was a powerful Cistercian abbot and a respected religious thinker. He would become one of the Templars' greatest supporters. To Bernard, the idea of a religious knight was not necessarily a contradiction. He believed that a warrior fighting for a religious cause could serve God under the right circumstances. The Templars needed precisely this kind of intellectual and religious justification. They were asking Europe to accept something extraordinary. Monks who fought, and Europe was listening. The order's fortunes began to change. At the Council of Troyes in 1129, the Templars received formal recognition from the Church. Their existence was now officially acknowledged. Their rules were established, and their future began to look very different. From a small group of knights in Jerusalem, they were becoming an international religious order. Europe would soon begin sending them donations. Nobles would give land. Kings would offer privileges. Ordinary people would contribute money. The Templars would acquire farms, churches, estates, and properties. And slowly, the poor knights would become something else, something much larger. Their network would spread across Europe. Their ships would cross the Mediterranean. Their castles would rise in the Holy Land. Their knights would fight in major battles. Their administrators would manage enormous resources, and their reputation would become almost as powerful as their armies. But none of that had happened yet. For now, a small group of men stood at the beginning of a journey they could not possibly understand. They had chosen a difficult life. They had chosen discipline over comfort. They had chosen service over personal wealth. and they had chosen a dangerous frontier far from their European homes. The world around them was changing. The Crusader states were becoming established. The Muslim powers surrounding them were watching. The church was beginning to support them, and European nobles were beginning to open their purses. The Knights Templar were about to become one of the most powerful organizations of the medieval world. But power would bring enemies. Wealth would bring suspicion, and fame would eventually bring destruction. Long before their final days in 1307, before the arrests, before the trials, before the burning of their leaders, there was simply a small brotherhood standing in Jerusalem. A few knights, a new rule, a dangerous road, and a dream of protecting pilgrims traveling toward the holy city. The story of the Knights Templar had begun, and the medieval world was about to discover just how far that small brotherhood could rise. The Knights Templar had begun as a small brotherhood in Jerusalem, but after the Council of Troyes in 1129, their future began to change. They were no longer simply a handful of knights trying to protect pilgrims. They were now an officially recognized religious order. And with recognition came something every growing institution needed: support. Across Europe, nobles began hearing about the strange new brotherhood in the Holy Land. These men were knights, they were Christians. They had taken religious vows, and they had dedicated their lives to protecting pilgrims and defending the Crusader states. For many medieval Christians, this was an inspiring idea. A knight could fight for a lord. He could fight for land. He could fight for wealth. But a Templar was supposed to fight for something greater. He was fighting in the service of God. This idea gave the order a powerful reputation. Donations began arriving. A nobleman might give the Templars a farm. Another might donate a village. A wealthy family might leave money to the order after death. Churches and estates could be transferred to their care. And gradually, the Templars began building a network that stretched far beyond Jerusalem. In France, England, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and other parts of Europe, Templar properties began appearing. They established houses known as commanderies. These were local centers that managed farms, estates, livestock, workshops, and other resources. The system was remarkably practical. A commandery in Europe could produce food and income. That wealth could then support the order's activities in the Eastern Mediterranean. A donation made by a European nobleman might eventually help feed a knight fighting thousands of miles away. The Templars were becoming an international organization. Their strength did not come only from swords. It came from organization. They learned how to manage land. They managed money. They transported supplies. They maintained horses. They recruited men. And they developed relationships with powerful rulers. This would eventually make them far more than a military order. But before that transformation could happen, they still had to prove themselves on the battlefield. The Crusader states remained vulnerable. Jerusalem was not surrounded by a single unified enemy. Instead, the political landscape was constantly changing. Different Muslim rulers competed with one another. Alliances shifted. Cities changed hands, and new leaders emerged. For the Templars, this meant constant uncertainty. They could spend 1 year defending a castle, and the next year escorting a military force across dangerous territory. Their lives were rarely peaceful. The order's rules demanded discipline. Templars were expected to live simply. Their clothing was regulated. Their personal possessions were limited. They were expected to obey their superiors. They ate together. They prayed together, and they fought together. The order was built around obedience. A knight could not simply decide to leave a battle because he was frightened. The Templar system depended upon discipline even when circumstances became terrifying. Their reputation grew partly because of this discipline. But the life of a Templar was not simply about fighting. There were long periods of preparation. Horses needed to be trained, weapons needed to be maintained, armor needed to be repaired, castles needed to be supplied, food needed to be stored, messages needed to be delivered. The order required administrators as well as warriors, and the larger it became, the more complicated its organization became. At the top stood the Grand Master. He was the senior leader of the order. Below him were commanders responsible for different territories and responsibilities. The structure allowed the Templars to operate across enormous distances. A message could travel from France to the Holy Land. Money could move from England to a Templar center in the Mediterranean. Supplies could be collected in Europe and shipped east. This growing network would eventually become one of their greatest strengths. It would also contribute to one of their most important developments, banking. But that would come later. For now, the Templars were still primarily concerned with the Crusader states, and one of the greatest challenges was the defense of roads. A pilgrim arriving at a port might still have hundreds of miles to travel. The road to Jerusalem could be dangerous. The Templars and other military orders helped provide protection. They established fortified positions. They escorted travelers. They guarded strategic routes. And they became part of the military infrastructure of the Crusader states. The Templars were not alone. Another major military order had also emerged, the Knights Hospitaller. Originally associated with caring for sick and poor pilgrims, the Hospitallers gradually developed a military role. The two orders would become famous rivals. Sometimes they cooperated, sometimes they competed. Both possessed land, both received donations, both developed castles, both maintained armed forces, and both became increasingly powerful. Their existence reflected a broader transformation in medieval Christianity. The Crusades had created a world where religion and warfare were closely connected. A knight could pray in the morning and fight in the afternoon. A castle could contain a chapel beside an armory. A monastery could become a military headquarters. For modern people, this combination can seem strange, but in the medieval world, it was understandable to many Christians. The Holy Land was believed to be sacred. Jerusalem was central to Christian history. Protecting Christian pilgrims and territories was considered a religious duty by many supporters of the Crusades. The Templars became one of the clearest expressions of that idea, yet their lives were not always glorious. The battlefield was dangerous. A Templar could be wounded. He could be captured. He could die far from home. And when a knight was captured, his fate could depend upon negotiations, ransom, or the decisions of his enemies. The order, therefore, needed resources. It needed horses. It needed armor. It needed fortifications. It needed ships. It needed food. It needed weapons. And all of these things cost money. European donations became increasingly important. As the Templars' reputation grew, more people trusted them. And that trust created another opportunity. People traveling long distances did not always want to carry large amounts of coin. Roads were dangerous. Robbery was a constant concern. The Templars could provide a safer alternative. A person might deposit money with the order in one location and receive access to funds somewhere else. The exact details varied, but the basic principle was simple. The Templars' international network could move wealth across borders. This made them increasingly useful to merchants, nobles, pilgrims, and rulers. Slowly, the poor knights were becoming wealthy, and the irony was impossible to miss. The men who had begun with vows of poverty were becoming guardians of enormous resources. But their wealth was not simply personal. It belonged to the order. The Templars owned land collectively. Their property supported their military mission. Their resources paid for soldiers, horses, ships, castles, and supplies. Still, To outsiders, the distinction could become difficult to see. A massive castle, a well-organized estate, a convoy carrying money, a heavily armed group of knights. These things looked like power, and power always attracts attention. By the middle of the 12th century, the Knights Templar were no longer an obscure brotherhood. They were becoming a major institution. Kings respected them, nobles supported them, church leaders defended them, pilgrims trusted them, and enemies feared them. But the Holy Land was entering a dangerous period. A new generation of Muslim leaders was beginning to unite territories that had once been divided. And among those leaders, one man would eventually rise above the others. His name would become inseparable from the history of the Crusades. He was known in the West as Saladin. The Templars had faced many enemies before, but they had never faced a leader quite like him. As the balance of power began to shift, the quiet confidence of the Crusader states would be tested. The Templars would discover that castles alone could not guarantee safety, and the road to Jerusalem would once again become a road to war. The story of the Knights Templar was beginning to change. For the first years of their existence, they had been a small brotherhood of religious warriors. They protected pilgrims, they guarded roads, they fought when necessary, and they depended heavily on donations from supporters across Europe. But as the decades passed, their influence grew, their castles became stronger, their wealth increased, their reputation spread, and their name became known across the Christian world. Yet the world around them was changing too. The Crusader states had never been as secure as they appeared. Jerusalem was surrounded by territories controlled by Muslim rulers. For years, those rulers had been divided among different dynasties and rival powers. This division had helped the Crusader states survive, but political divisions could disappear, and when they did, the balance of power could change very quickly. By the middle of the 12th century, a new generation of Muslim leaders was beginning to unite territories that had once been divided. Among them was a man who would become one of the most famous figures of the medieval world. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. In the West, he would be remembered as Saladin. Saladin was born in 1137 or 1138 in Tikrit, in modern-day Iraq. He grew up in a world shaped by political conflict. His family belonged to the Kurdish military elite. His father, Najm al-Din Ayyub, served important rulers. Saladin's early life did not suggest that he would become one of the most famous leaders of the Crusades, but circumstances would gradually push him toward power. He served under his uncle Shirkuh, a military commander who fought in campaigns connected to Egypt. Egypt was strategically important. Whoever controlled Egypt possessed enormous resources. It was wealthy, it had fertile farmland, it had access to the Nile, and it could provide soldiers and money. Saladin eventually became ruler of Egypt. From there, his influence expanded. He began building a larger political realm. He brought territories under his control. He strengthened his army. And most importantly, he worked towards something that had long been difficult for his Muslim rivals: unity. The Crusader states had survived partly because their enemies were divided. Saladin understood that if the Muslim territories remained fragmented, the Crusaders could continue exploiting those divisions. But if Egypt, Syria, and other territories could be brought together, the situation would be very different. The Templars were watching. They understood the danger, but the Crusader states had their own problems. Their rulers often disagreed with one another. Different nobles wanted different things. Some wanted peace, others wanted expansion. Some wanted to attack Muslim territories. Others feared provoking a larger war. The military orders often found themselves caught between political factions. The Templars could be powerful, but they could not control the entire Crusader kingdom. Their duty was to defend Christian territories. But which strategy was best? Defend the castles? Attack enemy cities? Protect trade routes? Escort pilgrims? Support a particular ruler? These questions were not always easy to answer. And there was another problem. The Templars were becoming increasingly wealthy. Their wealth allowed them to build stronger defenses, but it also made them valuable targets. Their castles were important, their estates were valuable, their knights were experienced, their political influence was growing, and their enemies understood that defeating the Templars could weaken the Crusader states. The tension slowly increased. Skirmishes became more common. Raids crossed borders. Castles were threatened, and both sides gathered intelligence. The Templars were not simply waiting behind their walls. They often participated in military expeditions. They rode with Crusader armies. They defended strategic positions, and they sometimes led charges against Muslim forces. Their battlefield reputation became increasingly formidable. A Templar force could be relatively small, but it was disciplined. The knights were heavily armed. Their horses were trained for combat. Their commanders understood the importance of formations, and their religious commitment gave them a willingness to endure enormous risks. But courage could not eliminate strategic problems. The Crusader states were surrounded by territories that could provide large armies. Their own population was relatively small. Reinforcements from Europe took months to arrive. Supplies had to cross the Mediterranean, and political disputes could weaken military campaigns. Saladin had a growing advantage. He was building a power base much closer to the Crusader states. He could draw resources from Egypt and Syria. He could recruit soldiers from a large territory, and he could move forces strategically. The Templars and their allies needed to be careful. A major defeat could have enormous consequences. For years, the struggle continued. There were battles, raids, negotiations, truces, and sudden outbreaks of violence. The Holy Land was not constantly at war in one continuous campaign. Instead, the conflict moved like a tide. Sometimes the Crusaders were stronger, sometimes Saladin was stronger. A fortress might remain in Christian hands for years. Then another fortress might fall. A truce could bring temporary peace. Then a raid could destroy it. For ordinary people, this instability was part of everyday life. Farmers planted crops without knowing who might control the surrounding countryside months later. Merchants traveled carefully. Pilgrims depended upon escorts. Soldiers waited in castles, and commanders watched the roads. Jerusalem remained the heart of the conflict. Whoever controlled the holy city possessed enormous symbolic power. For Christians, it was the city of Jesus. For Muslims, it was also deeply sacred. For Jews, Jerusalem held ancient religious significance. The city represented far more than territory. It represented faith, identity, and history. That made the struggle over Jerusalem especially intense. The Templars understood this better than almost anyone. Their very name was connected to the Temple Mount. Their purpose had been tied to the defense of Christian pilgrims and the Crusader states. And now, a powerful Muslim ruler was building an empire capable of challenging everything the Crusaders had established. Saladin did not immediately attack Jerusalem. He first strengthened his position. He united territories. He built alliances. He reorganized military forces, he waited for opportunities, and gradually the balance shifted. The Crusader leadership, meanwhile, became increasingly divided. There were rival factions. Different nobles supported different strategies. Some trusted diplomacy, others trusted military strength. The Templars often supported aggressive defense of the kingdom, but the order could not make decisions for everyone. This political fragmentation would become one of the Crusader state's greatest weaknesses. And then a new crisis emerged. A powerful Crusader nobleman named Renaud of Chatillon began attacking Muslim trade routes. He had already developed a reputation for aggressive behavior. His actions threatened existing truces. Saladin was furious. For years, Saladin had been building his power. Now he had a reason to strike. The fragile peace began to collapse. The Templars understood what that meant. War was coming, and this time, it would not be another small raid along a frontier. Saladin was preparing something much larger. The armies of the Crusader kingdom would soon gather. Knights would leave their castles. The Templars would ride with them. The banners of the Crusader states would appear across the landscape, and thousands of soldiers would march into the dry country of the Holy Land. They would be moving toward a place that would become one of the most famous battlefields of the medieval world, a place called Hattin. The battle there would change the history of the Crusades forever. For the Knights Templar, it would become one of the darkest days in their long history. And for Jerusalem, the consequences would be enormous. The road toward Hattin was already becoming dangerous. Across the Crusader kingdom, soldiers were gathering. Knights were preparing their horses. Weapons were being inspected. Messages were moving between castles. And in the distance, Saladin's army was gathering too. The fragile balance that had existed for years was beginning to collapse. The Crusader kingdom was facing its greatest military crisis since the capture of Jerusalem, and the Knights Templar were about to enter one of the most important battles of their history. The year was 1187. For decades, the Crusader states had survived through a combination of fortified castles, European reinforcements, local alliances, and military orders such as the Templars and Hospitallers. But survival had never been guaranteed. The kingdom was small, its armies were limited, and its enemies could draw soldiers from a much larger territory. Saladin had spent years preparing for this moment. He had united Egypt and much of Syria under his authority. He had strengthened his military. He had studied his opponents. And now he was ready. The immediate crisis had been created by Renaud of Chatillon. Despite periods of truce, Renaud had attacked Muslim caravans and threatened to raid Arabia. Saladin considered these actions a serious violation. His patience had reached its limit. The response would be enormous. Saladin began assembling an army that vastly outnumbered the forces normally available to the Crusader kingdom. The Christian leadership knew that a major confrontation was coming. King Guy of Lusignan gathered his forces. Knights came from across the kingdom. The Templars prepared to march. The Hospitallers prepared as well. The army included nobles, knights, infantrymen, archers, and soldiers from different regions. It was a powerful force, but it had a serious problem. The Crusader leaders were divided. They did not always agree on how to respond to Saladin. Some wanted to remain near water in defensive positions. Others believed they needed to move aggressively. Every decision mattered. The Holy Land could be unforgiving. The summer heat was intense, water was precious, an army could become exhausted quickly. Saladin understood this. He did not need to defeat the Crusader army immediately. He could force it to move, he could control access to water, he could harass its flanks. He could make the Christian soldiers increasingly tired. The Crusader army eventually decided to march toward Tiberias. The decision was controversial. Tiberias was under attack by Saladin. The wife of Raymond III of Tripoli was inside the city. Some Crusader leaders argued that the army should move to relieve the siege. Others warned that marching across dry country would expose the army to danger. Raymond of Tripoli himself reportedly advised caution. He knew the terrain. He understood Saladin's strategy. But King Guy ultimately decided to march. The army began moving. Imagine the scene. Thousands of soldiers crossing the dry landscape, banners rising above the columns, horses struggling beneath their riders, armor becoming unbearably hot under the summer sun, men searching for water, and somewhere beyond the horizon, Saladin was watching. The Templars were among the most experienced soldiers in the army. They knew what it meant to march in hostile territory. They knew the importance of discipline. They also understood the danger of being surrounded. But even the best soldiers could not fight thirst. As the army moved closer to the Sea of Galilee, the situation became worse. Saladin's forces controlled important water sources. The Christian army was being pushed toward an area where water was scarce. The sun beat down. The horses became exhausted. The soldiers grew thirsty. The march became slower, and the army's formation began to suffer. At night, the Crusaders tried to rest, but there was little comfort. The enemy was nearby. Muslim troops harassed the camp. Archers fired from a distance. Drums and horns echoed through the darkness. The soldiers could not relax. The next day would be worse. The army continued toward Hattin. The location consisted of two prominent hills rising above the surrounding landscape. Near them was an area known for a pair of volcanic peaks called the Horns of Hattin. The terrain would soon become a trap. Saladin's army surrounded the Crusaders. The Christian soldiers were thirsty and exhausted. Their access to water had been cut off. The Sea of Galilee was nearby, but reaching it was another matter. The Crusader army was trapped between Saladin's forces and the dry hills. The commanders realized the danger. They attempted to reorganize, but the army was already suffering. Some horses collapsed. Men struggled beneath their armor. Water containers became precious. The Templars and other knights prepared for battle. They knew there would be no easy escape. On July 4th, 1187, the Battle of Hattin began. Saladin's forces attacked from multiple directions. The Crusader army tried to break through. The fighting became intense. The Templars fought alongside the other knights. Their heavy cavalry charges were powerful. When a formation of armored knights moved together, it could strike with enormous force. But the Crusaders were surrounded. Their horses were exhausted. Their soldiers were dehydrated. And Saladin had overwhelming numbers. The Christian army attempted to reach the water, but Saladin's forces prevented them. Smoke filled the battlefield. The dry grass caught fire in places. The heat became unbearable. The battlefield turned into a scene of confusion. Men shouted, horses screamed, weapons clashed, and the banners of the different military forces moved through clouds of dust. The Templars fought desperately, but courage could not change the strategic situation. The Crusader army was collapsing. King Guy was eventually captured. Raymond of Tripoli managed to escape with a portion of the army, but many others were killed or captured. Among the prisoners were important members of the Crusader leadership. The Templars suffered enormous losses. Their defeat at Hattin was devastating. For the Crusader kingdom, it was catastrophic. The army that had been expected to defend Jerusalem had been destroyed. The road toward the holy city was now open. Saladin had achieved what previous Muslim rulers had struggled to accomplish. He had broken the main military strength of the Crusader kingdom, and the consequences were immediate. Castle after castle began surrendering. Some garrisons resisted, others negotiated. But the Christian defenses were weakened. The Templars could no longer protect every fortress. Their forces had been devastated at Hattin. The survivors were scattered, and Saladin's army continued advancing. Jerusalem itself was now in danger. The city that had stood at the heart of the Crusader kingdom for nearly a century was about to face a siege. For the Templars, this was more than the loss of another fortress. Jerusalem was connected to the very identity of their order. Their name came from the temple. Their purpose had been connected to the holy city, and now the city was surrounded. Inside Jerusalem, defenders prepared for the inevitable. The walls were repaired, weapons were gathered. Civilians crowded into the city. The Templars who remained began preparing for a final defense. They knew the situation was desperate, but they also knew something else. They could not simply abandon Jerusalem. For nearly a century, the city had been the center of the Crusader world. Its churches, its walls, its sacred places, its streets, its memories. Everything was about to change. Outside the walls, Saladin's army waited. Inside, the defenders prepared, and somewhere among them were the surviving Knights Templar. They had risen from a small brotherhood of knights to one of the most powerful military orders in Christendom. Now, they were preparing to defend the city where their story had begun. The battle for Jerusalem was about to begin, and this time, the Templars would be fighting not for another castle, but for the holy city itself. Jerusalem stood surrounded. The year was 1187. For nearly a century, the city had been at the heart of the Crusader states. Its walls had witnessed armies arrive from distant lands. Pilgrims had walked through its gates. Kings had ruled from its palaces. Knights had sworn oaths in its churches. And the Knights Templar had built much of their identity around the holy city. Now, everything was about to change. After the devastating defeat at Hattin, the Crusader army had been shattered. Thousands of soldiers had been killed or captured. King Guy of Lusignan was a prisoner. Many important nobles were gone. The Templars and Hospitallers had suffered terrible losses, and Saladin's army was advancing. One fortress after another surrendered. Some commanders negotiated, others resisted, but the great network of Crusader defenses was beginning to collapse. Jerusalem itself was now the greatest prize. Inside the city, panic spread. Civilians crowded the streets. Refugees arrived from surrounding areas. Food supplies became precious. Defenders rushed to repair damaged sections of the walls. Every able-bodied person had a role. The city's military leadership had to make a difficult decision. They had far fewer soldiers than they had expected. The army that should have defended Jerusalem had been destroyed at Hattin. Only a limited number of experienced warriors remained. Among them were Knights Templar. The Templars had suffered enormously during the campaign, but some survivors had reached Jerusalem. They now prepared to defend the city. Their white mantles and red crosses represented a military order that had once seemed almost unstoppable. Now, they were among the defenders of a city with very few options. Saladin approached Jerusalem carefully. He understood the city's symbolic importance. Taking Jerusalem would be one of the greatest achievements of his career, but he also knew that destroying the city would serve little purpose. He wanted surrender if possible. Inside Jerusalem, however, the defenders were not ready to simply open the gates. The city needed a commander. The responsibility eventually fell to Balian of Ibelin. Balian had been outside Jerusalem when the crisis began. He had initially been allowed to enter the city under a promise that he would stay only briefly and then leave. But once he saw the desperate condition of the defenders, he chose to remain. He became one of the central figures in the city's defense. Balian understood the reality. Jerusalem did not have enough soldiers to defeat Saladin's army in open battle, so the city would have to rely on its walls. The walls of Jerusalem were formidable. They had been strengthened over generations. Towers overlooked the surrounding landscape. Defenders could fire arrows from above. Stones could be dropped on attackers. Gates could be reinforced, but even strong walls could not guarantee survival. Saladin's army was enormous. The siege began. Muslim forces surrounded the city. Their camps stretched across the landscape. Soldiers prepared siege equipment. Engineers studied the walls. And inside Jerusalem, the defenders watched. For the Templars, the siege carried an especially deep meaning. The order had been founded in Jerusalem. Their earliest home was associated with the Temple Mount. Now they were defending the city from which their organization had grown. The siege was not simply military, it was symbolic. Every day that Jerusalem remained in Christian hands became a small victory. But the pressure was enormous. The defenders needed food, they needed water, they needed arrows, they needed soldiers, and they needed hope. Balian began organizing the defense. Everyone capable of fighting was called upon. Even men without much military experience were given weapons. Some people who had never expected to fight became defenders of the walls. Women helped carry supplies. Workers repaired damaged fortifications. Clergy encouraged the population. The city became a community preparing for survival outside the walls. Saladin's soldiers prepared their siege engines. Large wooden machines were constructed. Archers moved into position. Engineers worked under protection. The defenders watched as the machinery grew. Then the attacks began. Projectiles crashed against the walls. Arrows filled the air. Defenders responded from the towers. The fighting continued, but the defenders faced a difficult reality. Every day of resistance consumed supplies. Every attack risked casualties, and there was little hope of outside help. The European armies that might once have relieved Jerusalem were gone. The Crusader field army had been destroyed. The remaining territories were collapsing. Jerusalem was isolated. Still, the defenders fought. The Templars were among the most experienced warriors on the walls. They understood siege warfare. They knew how to use defensive positions. They could identify weak points. They encouraged discipline among the defenders. Their presence gave the city some military confidence, but the situation continued deteriorating. Saladin shifted his attacks. He searched for weaknesses. Eventually, his forces concentrated on the northern section of the city. The defenders rushed to reinforce it. Every movement outside the walls created fear. Every sound of construction meant another siege engine. Every messenger brought another rumor. Would the walls hold? Would help arrive? Would Saladin offer terms? Would the city be stormed? The answers were uncertain. Then, the walls began to fail. A breach appeared. The defenders struggled to repair it. Saladin's forces were preparing to enter. The city faced destruction. Balian understood what could happen if Jerusalem was taken by force. The memories of earlier Crusader violence in 1099 were still part of the historical landscape. He feared that the population could be massacred. He therefore entered negotiations with Saladin. The discussions were tense. Balian reportedly warned that the defenders would fight to the death if necessary. They would destroy sacred sites. They would kill their own families. They would make the city worthless to capture. Whether every detail of later accounts is accurate is difficult to know, but the basic reality was clear. The defenders were desperate. Saladin had achieved a strategic victory, yet he also had a choice. He could storm Jerusalem or negotiate. Eventually, terms were agreed. The city would surrender. Its inhabitants would be allowed to leave under agreed conditions, though payment was required for many. The Christian defenders would give up the city. The siege was over. Jerusalem had fallen. For the Knights Templar, the loss was devastating. The city that had given their order its name and purpose was no longer under Christian control. The Templars would not disappear. Far from it. They would continue fighting, but their world had changed permanently. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves across Europe. The news was devastating to Christian rulers. Church leaders called for another crusade. Kings began preparing armies, and among those who responded was one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, Richard I of England. He would become known as Richard the Lionheart. The Third Crusade was beginning, and the Knights Templar would once again find themselves at the center of a massive struggle for the Holy Land. But the Order was no longer defending Jerusalem. It was now fighting to recover what had been lost. Their castles became essential. Their knights regrouped. Their European supporters prepared to send money and men. The fall of Jerusalem had been a terrible defeat, but it was not the end. The Templars had survived Hattin. They had survived the loss of Jerusalem. And now they were preparing for another chapter, a chapter filled with famous kings, famous battles, and one extraordinary encounter between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. The Third Crusade was about to begin, and the Knights Templar would ride once again. The fall of Jerusalem had changed everything. For nearly 90 years, the city had stood at the heart of the Crusader world. Now it was in Saladin's hands. The news traveled across Europe. Church bells rang. Courts mourned. Preachers called for another crusade. And kings began preparing for a journey toward the eastern Mediterranean. The response would become known as the Third Crusade. Among those preparing to fight was Richard I of England. Richard was already an experienced warrior. He was also ambitious, determined, and enormously powerful. Later generations would call him Richard the Lionheart. He would become one of the most famous kings of the Middle Ages. But the crusade was not only Richard's story. Other rulers joined the effort. Philip II of France prepared to travel east. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa also took the cross. Armies began moving toward the Mediterranean, and waiting in the Holy Land were the surviving forces of the Crusader states. The Knights Templar were there too. Their order had been badly damaged at Hattin. Many knights had been killed. Others had been captured. Their castles had fallen. Their headquarters in Jerusalem had been lost, but the order still existed, and its European network was still functioning. Money continued arriving. New recruits were coming. Horses were being gathered. Weapons were being shipped. The Templars were rebuilding. They had lost Jerusalem, but they had not lost their purpose. Now their purpose was to help recover Christian territory. The first major objective of the Third Crusade became Acre. The city was strategically important. It possessed an excellent harbor. Whoever controlled Acre could bring soldiers and supplies into the Holy Land. The Crusaders, therefore, needed it. But Saladin understood its importance too. Acre was heavily defended, and its location made the coming siege extremely complicated. Christian forces surrounded the city from the land. Saladin's army remained nearby. The sea connected Acre to the outside world. Ships could bring supplies to the defenders, so the Crusaders were not simply attacking a city, they were fighting an entire system of defense. The siege lasted for months. Conditions were terrible. Disease spread through the Crusader camps. Food became difficult to obtain. Rain turned the ground into mud. Heat exhausted the soldiers, and the defenders inside Acre continued resisting. The Templars played an important role. Their knights were experienced in siege warfare. They helped protect Crusader positions. They escorted troops. They defended sections of the lines. And they participated in attacks against the city. Their presence was especially valuable because the Crusaders needed disciplined soldiers. Acre became a battlefield of constant movement. During the day, siege engines attacked the walls. At night, defenders attempted surprise attacks. Archers fired from towers. Crusader engineers worked to build machines capable of breaking the defenses. And outside the city, Saladin's army waited. The Muslim army could attack the Crusaders from behind. This meant the besiegers themselves were under siege. The Crusaders had to maintain defensive lines facing both directions. One side faced Acre, the other faced Saladin. For the Templars, this was exactly the kind of warfare they had been trained to fight. They moved between danger zones. They protected important positions. They fought in small groups. And they maintained discipline even when conditions became chaotic. Eventually, more Crusaders arrived. The great rulers of Europe were approaching. Richard the Lionheart reached the Holy Land in 1191. His arrival transformed the Crusader army. Richard was an experienced commander. He was energetic. He was confident. And he was determined to defeat Saladin. The siege of Acre intensified. Richard personally became involved in the fighting. His arrival also created political tension. The Crusader army was made up of different groups: English soldiers, French soldiers, German troops, Italian sailors, local Crusaders, military orders. Everyone had different interests. Richard and Philip of France did not always agree. The Templars and Hospitallers sometimes competed. The Crusader leadership was powerful, but it was never completely united. Still, the pressure on Acre continued. The city became increasingly difficult to defend. Eventually, the defenders negotiated surrender. Acre fell to the Crusaders in July 1191. The victory was enormous. The Crusaders had regained a major port. They now had a secure base from which to continue the campaign. The Templars returned to the center of military activity. Their order was rebuilding its influence. And Richard now faced his greatest challenge. He had to decide where to strike next. Jerusalem was still in Saladin's hands. Richard wanted to take it, but marching directly toward Jerusalem would be extremely dangerous. The city lay inland. Water was scarce. Saladin controlled much of the surrounding countryside, and the Crusader army had already suffered from disease and exhaustion. Richard, therefore, moved carefully. His army marched south along the coast. The Templars were often positioned near the front and flanks. Their job was to protect the column. Saladin's forces harassed the Crusaders. Mounted archers attacked from a distance. They would approach quickly, fire arrows, and retreat before the heavily armored knights could respond. The Crusaders had to maintain discipline. If they broke formation and chased the attackers, they could be surrounded. Richard understood this. He ordered his army to stay organized. The Templars were particularly well suited to this kind of disciplined warfare. Their experience allowed them to endure attacks without immediately breaking formation. Then came one of the most famous battles of the Third Crusade. On September 7th, 1191, the armies met near Arsuf. Saladin's forces attacked repeatedly. The Crusader formation moved along the coast. The sea was on one side. The Muslim army was on the other. Arrows filled the air. Horses moved through clouds of dust. The Crusaders were under constant pressure, but Richard waited. He understood that timing was everything. The Templars held their position. The Hospitallers held theirs. The Crusader army continued moving. Eventually, Richard gave the order to attack. The Crusader cavalry charged. The impact was enormous. Heavily armored knights crashed into Saladin's forces. The Muslim army began to withdraw. The Battle of Arsuf was a major Crusader victory. Saladin had been defeated in open battle, but Richard did not immediately march on Jerusalem. He understood that winning a battle was not the same as winning the war. The Crusaders still faced enormous logistical problems. Jerusalem remained heavily defended. Winter was approaching. Supplies were limited, and Saladin's army was still intact. Richard therefore continued cautiously. He captured and strengthened positions along the coast. The Templars helped secure the Crusader advance. But the dream of Jerusalem remained ahead. For many Crusaders, the entire purpose of the Third Crusade was to recover the Holy City. Yet Richard increasingly understood that capturing Jerusalem might not be enough. Could the Crusaders hold it? Could they defend it? Could they supply it? Could they survive another campaign by Saladin? These questions troubled the commanders. The Templars understood the danger better than most. They had seen what happened after Hattin. They had seen castles fall. They had seen Jerusalem surrounded. They knew that a city could be captured and then lost again. Richard eventually approached Jerusalem. The walls could be seen in the distance. For the Crusaders, it was an emotional moment. They had come so far. The Holy City was close. But Richard hesitated. He knew that an assault could end in disaster. Saladin was waiting. The Crusader army was exhausted, and the political unity of the campaign was fragile. The Templars were ready to fight, but readiness was not the same as victory. The question became, should Richard attack, or should he negotiate? That decision would shape the final stage of the Third Crusade. And while Richard and Saladin remained enemies, they would also develop a strange relationship of mutual respect. Their armies would continue fighting. Their messengers would continue traveling between camps, and their names would eventually become permanently connected: the Lionheart and the Sultan. Two leaders separated by religion, language, and culture, yet both recognized the ability of the other. The Knights Templar stood between these enormous forces. Their order had survived the loss of Jerusalem. It had survived Hattin. It had helped retake Acre. It had fought at Arsuf. And now, it was approaching the Holy City once again. But the Templars would soon discover that the hardest decisions were not always made with swords. Sometimes, the fate of Jerusalem depended upon diplomacy, and the next chapter would bring the Crusaders closer than ever to their goal. Richard stood before a difficult choice. Jerusalem was close. After years of war, the Crusaders had finally reached the region surrounding the Holy City. The walls could be seen in the distance. For many of the soldiers, this was the moment they had dreamed about since leaving Europe. They had crossed the sea. They had survived disease. They had fought at Acre. They had marched through the burning landscape. They had faced Saladin's army at Arsuf. And now, Jerusalem was almost within reach. But Richard the Lionheart understood something that many of his soldiers did not. Taking Jerusalem was one thing. Keeping it was another. The city was surrounded by territory controlled by Saladin. The Crusader army had limited supplies. Its leaders were divided, and winter was approaching. A direct assault could result in another disaster. Richard therefore hesitated. The Templars understood his concerns. They had already witnessed what happened when the Crusader army rushed into battle without adequate preparation. Hattin had taught them a terrible lesson. A strong army could be destroyed by thirst, poor planning, and division. Richard did not want another Hattin. So the Crusaders stopped, they waited, they discussed their options, and while they waited, Saladin was watching. The Muslim army was not defeated. Although Richard had won at Arsuf, Saladin remained a formidable opponent. He had lost a battle, but he had not lost the war. His army could still defend Jerusalem. His forces controlled the surrounding countryside, and he knew that the Crusaders could not remain in the region forever. The Crusaders eventually advanced toward Jerusalem again. This time, they came even closer. For a moment, it seemed as though the holy city might finally be theirs. The soldiers could see the mountains around Jerusalem. The sight must have been extraordinary. After so much hardship, the destination was finally visible, but once again, the commanders debated. Some argued that they should attack immediately. Others feared that they would capture the city only to lose it again. The Templars were experienced enough to understand the danger. A castle could be captured, a wall could be breached, but an army needed food, it needed water, it needed reinforcements, it needed secure roads. Without those things, a victory could quickly become a defeat. Richard eventually decided not to attack. The decision disappointed many Crusaders. Some believed he had abandoned the purpose of the entire campaign. But Richard had another strategy. He wanted to strengthen the Crusader position along the coast. By controlling important ports and roads, the Crusaders could create a stronger kingdom. Then perhaps Jerusalem could be taken later, but time was running out. Political problems were also growing. Richard had to think about Europe. His kingdom needed him. His enemies at home could take advantage of his absence. And another Crusader leader was becoming increasingly important, Conrad of Montferrat. Conrad had played a major role in the defense of Tyre. He was a powerful political figure. His supporters wanted him to become king of Jerusalem. Richard had other ideas. The Crusader leadership became divided. These political disagreements weakened the campaign. The Templars and Hospitallers were caught in the middle. Military orders had their own interests. They needed to protect their territories. They needed to preserve their wealth. And they had to decide which political leaders to support. The Crusader army was therefore fighting two battles at once, one against Saladin and another against its own divisions. Richard eventually moved toward negotiations. Messengers traveled between the Crusader and Muslim camps. At first, this might seem strange. Only months earlier, these armies had been killing one another. Now their leaders were exchanging letters. But diplomacy was a normal part of medieval warfare. A truce could save lives. A treaty could protect territory. And sometimes, negotiation could achieve what a battlefield could not. Richard and Saladin never met face to face during the Third Crusade, but their representatives carried messages between them. Each side respected the strength of the other. Richard was known for his military ability. Saladin was respected for his leadership and political skill. Their relationship became one of the most famous rivalries in medieval history. But the reality was more complicated than later legends suggested. They were not friends, they were enemies. They were fighting for different causes, but they understood one another as capable leaders, and neither wanted to destroy everything simply for pride. Meanwhile, the Templars continued playing a critical role. Their castles remained important. Their knights guarded roads. Their forces protected Crusader territory. And their European network continued supplying the war. The order was recovering from the disaster of 1187. Its losses had been enormous. But the Third Crusade had given it a new purpose. The Templars were once again becoming one of the most important military organizations in the Holy Land. Their reputation was growing, but so was their political importance. Kings trusted them. Nobles depended upon them. Merchants used their financial services. And military commanders valued their soldiers. The order was becoming something far larger than the small brotherhood that had begun in Jerusalem. But the more powerful the Templars became, the more complicated their future would be. For now, however, their attention remained on the Crusader states. Richard continued negotiating. The possibility of recovering Jerusalem remained uncertain, and eventually the Crusaders decided to advance again. This time, they would not necessarily attack the city. Instead, they would strengthen their position. They would rebuild castles, secure roads, protect the coast, and prepare for whatever came next. The war had become a contest of endurance. Saladin did not need to destroy Richard's army. He only needed to prevent it from achieving its objective. Richard did not need to conquer all of Saladin's territory. He needed to secure enough of the Crusader kingdom to make its survival possible. Both sides understood this. The war was changing. It was no longer simply about one battlefield. It was about resources, alliances, fortifications, diplomacy, and time. Eventually, Richard and Saladin reached a truce. The agreement, concluded in 1192, became known as the Treaty of Jaffa. The Crusaders retained a significant stretch of the coastline. Christian pilgrims were allowed access to Jerusalem, but Jerusalem itself remained under Muslim control. For the Crusaders, this was a compromise. For Richard, it was not the complete victory he had hoped for, but it preserved a Christian presence in the Holy Land. And for Saladin, Jerusalem remained his. The Third Crusade was ending. Richard prepared to leave. Saladin would remain in the east. The armies that had fought each other for years would slowly disperse. The Templars, however, would remain. Their role in the Holy Land was far from finished. They had lost Jerusalem. They had helped defend Acre. They had fought at Arsuf. They had marched toward the Holy City. And now they had to rebuild the Crusader states. The Order's headquarters would eventually shift toward Acre. The city would become the center of what remained of the Crusader kingdom. The Templars would build and strengthen their presence there. But something had changed. The dream of a permanently secure Christian Jerusalem was fading. The Templars were no longer defending an expanding kingdom. They were defending a shrinking one. Their castles stood on increasingly dangerous frontiers. Their enemies remained powerful, and European support could never be guaranteed. Still, the Order endured, for now. The Third Crusade had shown the world that the Templars were not simply religious warriors. They were becoming an international power. Their wealth was increasing. Their political connections were expanding. Their military reputation was stronger than ever. But the future would bring new challenges. The Crusader states would continue to shrink, new enemies would rise, and the Templars would eventually become involved in conflicts far beyond Jerusalem. Their greatest days were still ahead, and so were their darkest, because the same organization that could command castles, armies, ships, and enormous wealth would one day become the target of a king who wanted all of it. But that day was still more than a century away. For now, the Templars remained in the Holy Land. Their banners still flew above their castles. Their knights still rode across the roads, and the red cross still appeared on the white mantles of men who had sworn to defend their order until death. The crusade was over, but the age of the Knights Templar was only beginning. The Third Crusade had ended. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. Richard the Lionheart had returned toward Europe. Saladin remained the dominant Muslim ruler in the region, and the Knights Templar were still standing. For an order that had suffered so much during the disaster at Hattin, this was remarkable. The Templars had lost thousands of men. They had lost Jerusalem. They had lost castles. They had watched much of the Crusader kingdom collapse. Yet their organization had survived. And now they faced a new reality. The Crusader states were smaller. The dream of conquering the entire Holy Land was becoming increasingly difficult. Instead of expanding, the Crusaders were now trying to survive. The city of Acre became the center of their remaining territory. For the Templars, Acre would become extremely important. Their headquarters eventually moved there. From Acre, the order could coordinate military operations, manage supplies, communicate with Europe, and defend the remaining Christian territories. The city was crowded. Merchants filled its streets. Ships arrived from Mediterranean ports. Pilgrims passed through. Knights moved between castles. Languages from across Europe and the Middle East could be heard in its markets. Acre was a frontier city, but it was also a commercial center, and the Templars were perfectly positioned to take advantage of that. Their network stretched across Europe. They owned farms. They controlled estates. They managed warehouses. They had ships. They had money. And they had trusted agents operating in distant regions. The Templars could move resources from one part of their network to another. This made them increasingly useful to rulers and wealthy individuals. Imagine a medieval nobleman preparing for a journey. He might have to carry valuable coins across dangerous roads. Bandits could attack. Coins could be lost. Travel could take months. The Templars offered an alternative. A person could deposit money with a Templar house in one location. The order could then arrange for funds to be made available elsewhere. This was not modern banking, but it provided a practical financial service. And because the Templars had a reputation for discipline and security, people trusted them. Their financial influence grew. The order was becoming both a military institution and a major economic organization. This transformation was gradual. It did not happen overnight. But by the 13th century, the Templars had become one of the most financially powerful religious orders in Europe. Their wealth allowed them to build, and they built extensively. Castles rose across the Crusader territories. Some were placed on mountains. Others guarded roads. Some controlled important ports. These fortresses were designed to survive prolonged attacks. Thick walls, towers, storage rooms, wells, chapels, barracks. Everything was designed around defense. The Templars learned from experience. They had seen what happened when castles fell. They had watched Jerusalem surrender. They had seen armies trapped without water. Their fortifications reflected those lessons. A strong castle could delay an enemy for weeks or even months. That delay could be enough for reinforcements to arrive, but castles were expensive. Stone had to be quarried. Workers had to be paid. Food had to be stored. Weapons had to be maintained. Garrisons needed horses and supplies. The Templars' European wealth helped make this possible. And as their military role continued, their political role grew too. Kings increasingly trusted the order. Some rulers deposited money with the Templars, others borrowed from them. The order could provide financial assistance during the military campaigns. This created relationships with European monarchs that would later become extremely important. For now, the Templars seemed almost untouchable. They answered to the church. They possessed enormous privileges. They operated across borders. They could move money and people. They maintained armed forces, and they had powerful supporters. But there was a hidden danger in all of this. The Templars were becoming independent. A king might control his kingdom. A noble might control his estate. But the Templars existed across many kingdoms. Their properties were spread throughout Europe. Their leadership answered primarily to the order itself in the church. They were not simply subjects of one monarch. This independence was one of their greatest strengths. It would eventually become one of their greatest weaknesses. Meanwhile, the Crusader states remained under pressure. After Saladin's death in 1193, his empire became divided among his successors. This gave the Crusaders some breathing room, but the danger never disappeared. New rulers rose, new alliances formed, and the political situation changed constantly. The Templars were expected to adapt. Sometimes they fought, sometimes they negotiated, sometimes they supported truces. Their purpose was no longer simply to conquer, it was to preserve what remained. This meant defending castles, protecting roads, guarding pilgrims, and participating in campaigns whenever Christian rulers called upon them. But the Crusader states were becoming increasingly fragile. Europe could send new armies, but each crusade was expensive. Travel across the Mediterranean was dangerous. European rulers had political problems at home, and not every monarch wanted to spend years fighting in the East. The Templars, therefore, became increasingly important. They were permanently present. They did not have to wait for a king to arrive from Europe. They were already there. Their knights knew the terrain. Their commanders understood the enemy. Their castles could serve as military bases, and their financial network could help fund campaigns. The order's influence continued to grow, but the world around them was becoming more complicated. Christian and Muslim states were not always at war. Trade continued. Merchants crossed political borders. Diplomats negotiated. Truces were established. Sometimes enemies traded with one another. Sometimes they exchanged prisoners. The Holy Land was not simply a permanent battlefield. It was a place where different cultures lived alongside one another, sometimes peacefully and sometimes violently. The Templars existed within this complicated environment. Their role was military, but their daily lives also involved administration, trade, transportation, and diplomacy. And as the 13th century progressed, a new threat began appearing on the horizon, not from Europe, not from the traditional Muslim rulers of Syria and Egypt, but from far to the east. The Mongols were expanding across Asia. Their armies had conquered enormous territories. Their arrival would transform the politics of the Middle East. For a moment, some crusaders wondered whether the Mongols might become allies against their Muslim enemies. But alliances in the medieval world were never simple. The Templars would soon have to navigate a changing political landscape. And another power was also rising, the Mamluks. They would eventually become the most dangerous enemies of the remaining Crusader states. Their armies were disciplined, their commanders were experienced, and they were determined to eliminate the Crusader presence. The Templars would face them again and again. Their castles would be attacked, their knights would die, their territories would shrink, and one by one, the great Crusader strongholds would begin falling. The Templars could defend a castle, they could win a battle, they could move money across continents, but they could not stop history from changing. The world that had created the Knights Templar was slowly disappearing. Jerusalem was already gone. The Crusader kingdom was shrinking. European enthusiasm was weakening, and new powers were rising. Yet the Templars continued to believe in their mission. Their banners still flew. Their knights still trained. Their ships still crossed the Mediterranean. Their estates still produced wealth. Their castles still stood, and their name still carried enormous authority. For nearly 2 centuries, they had adapted to almost every crisis. But the next century would test them more severely than anything before. The final Christian strongholds in the Holy Land would begin to fall, and when they did, the Templars would have to confront a question they had avoided for generations. If there was no longer a Christian kingdom to defend, what would become of the Knights Templar? The question was becoming impossible to ignore. If there was no longer a Christian kingdom to defend, what would become of the Knights Templar? For decades, the order had been built around the struggle for the Holy Land. Their castles stood along the frontier, their knights guarded roads, their ships carried supplies, their European estates provided money, and their headquarters in Acre connected the entire organization. But the Crusader states were shrinking. The 13th century had brought new enemies. The Mongols had transformed the political world of the Middle East. The Mamluks were becoming increasingly powerful, and the Crusader territories were becoming smaller with every passing decade. The Templars continued to fight, but now they were fighting mostly to survive. One of the greatest threats came from the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt. The Mamluks were military rulers whose armies had become among the most effective forces in the region. Their soldiers were experienced cavalrymen. Their commanders understood siege warfare, and they had a clear objective: remove the remaining Crusader strongholds from the eastern Mediterranean. The Templars were one of the greatest obstacles standing in their way. Their castles were difficult to capture, their knights were disciplined, and their European network continued providing reinforcements. But the Mamluks had an enormous advantage. They could draw resources from Egypt and Syria. The Crusaders depended heavily on Europe, and Europe was far away. A message could take weeks or months to travel. An army could take even longer. The Templars therefore had to defend themselves with whatever resources were already available. Their castles became increasingly important. Among the most famous was the fortress known as Chateau Pèlerin, or Athlete. It stood on the coast, south of Acre. The fortress was built to control movement along the coastline. Its massive walls demonstrated the military engineering of the Templars. But even the strongest fortress could not change the larger political situation. The Crusader states were surrounded, and their territory was shrinking. The Templars also held important castles farther north. One of the most famous was Safed. The fortress stood on a strategic hill and commanded important routes. Its position made it extremely valuable. The Mamluks understood this. In 1266, Sultan Baybars besieged Safed. The Templars defended it fiercely, but eventually the fortress fell. The loss was devastating. Safed had been considered one of the strongest Crusader fortresses. Its fall demonstrated how powerful the Mamluks had become. The Templars continued fighting, but the pattern was becoming clear. The Mamluks attacked. The Crusaders defended. A castle fell. Another became isolated. The territory around it disappeared, and slowly, the Crusader kingdom contracted toward the coast. Acre became more important than ever. It was the last great center of Crusader power. The city was crowded with soldiers, merchants, refugees, and religious communities. The Templars maintained a major presence there. The Hospitallers were also present. Other military orders remained. The city became a final refuge for the Crusader states. But everyone understood the danger. If Acre fell, there would be little left. Meanwhile, the Templars continued their financial activities. Their European network was still extensive. They owned properties. In many kingdoms, they received donations. They managed estates. They transported money. They provided financial services. Their wealth remained enormous, but their military mission was becoming harder to justify. Europe was increasingly distracted by its own problems. Kings were fighting other kings. Nobles were competing for power. The papacy had its own political struggles. The enthusiasm for new crusades was declining. The Templars could no longer assume that Europe would send a massive army whenever the Holy Land was threatened. This was becoming painfully obvious. The order, therefore, became more dependent on itself. Its European properties supported its remaining operations. Its castles provided defensive positions. Its ships moved supplies. Its knights remained ready. But there was no easy solution. The Crusader states needed a major European intervention. Europe was reluctant to provide one. The Templars could delay the inevitable, but they could not reverse the entire political situation. Then came the rise of Sultan al-Mansur Qalawun. He became one of the most important Mamluk rulers. Under his leadership, the pressure on the Crusader states intensified. In 1289, Tripoli fell to the Mamluks. The loss shocked the Crusaders. Another major city was gone. The remaining territories were now concentrated around Acre and a few other coastal positions. The Templars knew what was coming. Acre would be next. Qalawun planned to attack, but before he could do so, he died. His son, Al-Ashraf Khalil, continued the campaign. By 1291, the final crisis had arrived. The Mamluk army gathered around Acre. Thousands of soldiers approached the city. Siege engines followed. The defenders prepared. The Templars were ready. The Hospitallers were ready. The other defenders were ready. But they knew the odds. Acre had strong walls. It had experienced soldiers. It had access to the sea, but the Mamluks had enormous numbers. They also possessed powerful siege equipment. The final siege began in April 1291. The city was surrounded. Mamluk siege engines began attacking the walls. The defenders responded with arrows, stones, and counterattacks. The Templars fought from the fortifications. Their knights made sorties outside the walls. They attacked siege positions. They attempted to disrupt the Mamluk army, but the pressure was relentless. Day after day, the walls shook under the impact of siege engines. Smoke rose above the city. People crowded into churches and fortified buildings. Food became scarce. The defenders waited for reinforcements, but no great European army arrived. The final Christian stronghold was being destroyed. The Templars understood what the fall of Acre would mean. They would lose their headquarters. They would lose their base. They would lose the last major city of the Crusader kingdom. And after nearly 2 centuries, the Christian military presence in the Holy Land would be almost completely gone. Still, the Templars refused to surrender easily. They continued fighting. Their knights defended the walls. They organized counterattacks. They tried to keep the city alive, but the Mamluks continued advancing. Eventually, the walls were breached. The fighting moved into the city. The defenders were overwhelmed. Acre fell on May 18th, 1291. The Crusader kingdom had effectively ended. The Templars had lost their greatest remaining stronghold. Many knights were killed. Others escaped by sea. Some found refuge elsewhere. The order itself survived, but its original purpose had been shattered. There was no longer a Crusader kingdom to defend. Jerusalem had been gone for more than a century. Acre was gone. The great castles were falling. The Holy Land was no longer under Crusader control. The Templars withdrew to Cyprus. There, they attempted to reorganize. They still had wealth. They still had European estates. They still had knights. They still had ships. They still had powerful connections. But the question that had been approaching for decades was now unavoidable. What was the purpose of the Knights Templar without the Crusader states? The Order had been created for the Holy Land. Now the Holy Land was lost. The Templars would need a new role. Some hoped for another crusade. Perhaps Europe would eventually send another great army. Perhaps Jerusalem could be recovered. Perhaps the Crusader states could be rebuilt. But such hopes were becoming increasingly unrealistic. The world had changed. The Mongols had changed the Middle East. The Mamluks had defeated the Crusader states. European monarchs had their own ambitions, and the Templars themselves had become extraordinarily wealthy and independent. For the first time, the Order had to look toward Europe, and there, a new kind of danger was waiting. Not an army, not a sultan, not a siege, a king. His name was Philip IV of France. He was ambitious. He was deeply concerned with money, and he had enormous debts. The Templars possessed exactly what Philip needed: wealth, land, and treasure. Soon, the most powerful military order in medieval Christendom would discover that its greatest enemy was not waiting in the Holy Land. He was sitting on a throne in France. The fall of Acre had changed the Knights Templar forever. For nearly 2 centuries, the order had been connected to the defense of the Holy Land. Jerusalem had been their beginning. Acre had become their final great stronghold. Now both were gone. The Templars had retreated to Cyprus, carrying with them what remained of their wealth, ships, archives, and surviving knights. But they still possessed something extraordinary: their European network. Across France, England, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and other parts of Europe, the Templars owned farms, estates, churches, warehouses, and commanderies. They still had money, they still had influence, and they still had powerful friends, but they no longer had a clear military mission. The Crusader states had disappeared. The Holy Land was lost. Another great crusade seemed increasingly unlikely. For the first time in their history, the Templars had to ask themselves what came next. Some members hoped that another expedition could eventually recover Jerusalem. Others focused on maintaining the Order's European possessions. The Templars continued managing their estates and financial activities. They remained involved in banking and administration. They still transported money. They still protected valuable goods. And they still maintained a disciplined organization. But something fundamental had changed. The Templars were no longer an essential military force in a permanent Crusader kingdom. Instead, they were a wealthy international institution operating inside European politics. And European politics could be dangerous. One of the most powerful rulers in Europe at the beginning of the 14th century was King Philip IV of France. Philip was intelligent, determined, and ambitious. He wanted to strengthen royal authority. He wanted France to become more powerful, and he constantly needed money. War was expensive. Administration was expensive. Maintaining royal armies and officials was expensive. Philip had already borrowed heavily, and one institution stood out as particularly wealthy: the Knights Templar. The Templars had accumulated enormous resources over generations. They owned land. They managed estates. They received donations. They held deposits. They possessed valuable property. Their European network was extensive. To Philip, their wealth was impossible to ignore. There was another problem. The Templars operated outside the direct control of the French crown. They answered to their own hierarchy. Their ultimate religious authority was the church. A king could not simply order the Templars to surrender their property. This independence had once protected the order. Now it made the Templars vulnerable. Philip had already come into conflict with the papacy. He believed royal authority should be strong. The Pope, meanwhile, defended the independence of the Church. The struggle between king and pope became increasingly intense, and the Templars were caught within this larger political world. The order was not necessarily Philip's enemy, but its wealth made it attractive, and its independence made it difficult to control. Philip's financial problems continued. The king needed money. The Templars had money. That combination would eventually prove disastrous. Meanwhile, the Templars themselves were still hoping for a new crusade. Their leaders continued thinking about the Holy Land. They maintained military traditions. They kept ships. They trained knights. They discussed strategies for recovering lost territory. But Europe had changed. Kings were more interested in their own political conflicts. The crusading movement no longer possessed the same strength it had during the 12th century. The loss of Acre had been a major psychological blow. There was no obvious path back to Jerusalem. Still, the Templars survived. They continued their daily routines. Knights prayed. Administrators managed estates. Messengers traveled between commanderies. Money moved across borders and in castles and monasteries throughout Europe. The Red Cross of the Templars continued to appear. The order might have believed that its future was uncertain, but it could not have imagined how quickly everything was about to change. The first signs appeared in France. Rumors began circulating about the Templars. Some accusations were vague. Some claimed the order had become too wealthy. Others questioned their secrecy. Because the Templars had private ceremonies and strict internal rules, outsiders often knew little about what happened inside the order. That lack of knowledge created space for suspicion, and suspicion could easily become accusation. Philip IV's government began gathering information. The king's officials searched for ways to attack the order's reputation. Eventually, accusations emerged. The Templars were accused of heresy. They were accused of denying Christ. They were accused of improper religious practices. Some were accused of worshiping strange objects. Other allegations involved secret ceremonies and immoral behavior. These accusations were extraordinary. The Templars were a religious military order. Their entire identity was built around Christianity. They prayed, they attended religious services, they fought in the name of Christianity. They had received enormous support from the church. So how could such accusations suddenly become believable? The answer was partly political. The king needed a justification for moving against the order. If the Templars could be portrayed as heretics, their wealth could potentially be seized, their privileges could be challenged, and their independence could be destroyed. But there was another important figure, Pope Clement V. The Pope was not initially eager to destroy the Templars. He knew the order had powerful supporters. He also knew that accusations against a major religious institution were extremely serious. The church had to investigate, but Philip moved quickly. He did not wait for a long church investigation. Instead, he prepared a coordinated action. Letters were sent to royal officials. Orders were issued. Plans were kept secret. The Templars had no idea what was coming. Then came the morning of October 13th, 1307. Across France, royal officials moved against the order. Templars were arrested. Their houses were seized. Their property was taken into royal custody. Knights who had spent their lives fighting for the church suddenly found themselves imprisoned by Christian soldiers. The shock was enormous. The order had survived Muslim armies. It had survived the fall of Jerusalem. It had survived the loss of Acre. But now, Its greatest crisis had arrived inside Christian Europe. The arrests were not limited to a handful of senior leaders. Large numbers of Templars were detained. The accusations were presented as evidence of a terrible secret, and once the arrests began, the machinery of the investigation became increasingly brutal. Some prisoners were interrogated, some were tortured. Confessions began appearing. Templars admitted to things they had previously denied, but the circumstances of those confessions would become one of the most controversial parts of the entire story. Were the accusations true? Or were frightened prisoners confessing because they were being tortured? The truth would become difficult to determine. Meanwhile, Philip's campaign continued. He wanted the Templars destroyed, but the order was protected by the church, and that meant the king had entered a dangerous confrontation with the Pope. Pope Clement V now faced enormous pressure. If he defended the Templars, he risked conflict with the French crown. If he accepted the accusations, he risked destroying a religious order without sufficient evidence. The Pope chose investigation, but Philip was not willing to wait. The arrests had already happened. The Templars were already imprisoned. Their property was already being controlled. Their reputation was collapsing. And across Europe, people were beginning to wonder whether the legendary Knights Templar had been hiding a terrible secret all along. The order that had once inspired admiration was now surrounded by suspicion. The white mantles were gone. The red crosses had become symbols of accusation, and the men who had once guarded Jerusalem were now fighting for their own survival. The final chapter of the Knights Templar had begun, but the strangest part of the story was still ahead, because after the arrests, there would be confessions, trials, executions, and a mystery that would survive for centuries. What had really happened behind the walls of the Templar houses? And what, if anything, had become of their legendary treasure? The Knights Templar had survived armies, sieges, and the fall of Jerusalem. But now their enemies were not Muslim armies standing outside a castle. Their enemies were fellow Christians, and the most dangerous weapon against them was not a sword. It was an accusation. After the arrests of October 13th, 1307, hundreds of Templars across France found themselves imprisoned. Their castles, houses, estates, and possessions were seized. The order that had once commanded enormous respect suddenly appeared powerless. King Philip IV of France had moved quickly. He wanted the Templars investigated for heresy and other religious crimes. But there was a serious problem. The Templars were a religious order recognized by the Church. Their members had taken vows. They had fought for Christianity, and for generations popes had protected their privileges. Philip, therefore, needed something more than arrests. He needed confessions. The royal investigators began questioning the prisoners. At first, many Templars denied the accusations. They insisted that they were faithful Christians. They rejected claims that they had denied Christ or worshipped forbidden objects. But the interrogations became increasingly severe. Torture was used in some investigations. This is important when considering the confessions that followed. A confession obtained under extreme physical or psychological pressure cannot simply be treated as straightforward evidence of guilt. Some Templars eventually admitted to various accusations. Others continued to deny them, and some later withdrew their confessions. The result was confusion. What had the Templars actually done? Had there been secret initiation rituals? Had some members behaved improperly? Had the order developed practices that outsiders misunderstood? Or were the accusations largely constructed to destroy the organization? The historical evidence is complicated, The Templars were certainly secretive in some aspects of their internal life. They had ceremonies that outsiders did not normally witness, but secrecy by itself was not proof of heresy. Military orders naturally had private rules and procedures, and medieval religious institutions often had rituals unfamiliar to ordinary people. Yet once the accusations had been made, rumors spread quickly. Stories appeared about strange ceremonies. Some prisoners were accused of denying Christ during initiation. Others were accused of spitting on a cross. There were allegations involving mysterious idols. One alleged object would later become famous in Templar mythology. It was called the Baphomet, but the evidence surrounding this supposed Templar idol is extremely complicated. The word appears in medieval records, connected with accusations against the order. However, there is no convincing evidence that the Templars possessed a single mysterious idol worshipped throughout the organization. Later centuries would transform the idea into something much larger. The legendary Baphomet would eventually become associated with occult imagery, but that later image should not simply be projected backward onto the medieval Templars. The reality was much less certain. Meanwhile, Pope Clement V was attempting to take control of the investigation. He did not want Philip IV deciding the fate of a major religious order by himself. The Pope ordered investigations in different regions. Templars were questioned. Church officials examined evidence. Witnesses were interviewed, and the results varied. Some Templars confessed. Others denied everything. Some who had previously confessed later said they had been forced. This created an enormous legal and religious problem. If the confessions were genuine, the order might have been guilty of serious crimes. If the confessions had been produced through torture, then the entire case against the Templars was deeply compromised. The issue became even more complicated because different governments handled the Templars differently. In France, Philip's pressure was enormous. In other parts of Europe, the process could be slower. Some rulers were less willing to destroy the order immediately. The Templars therefore experienced different fates depending on where they lived. But their international network was collapsing. Their properties were being seized. Their commanders were imprisoned. Their financial operations were disrupted. Their reputation was damaged. And the order's leadership was under enormous pressure. At the center of the crisis stood the Grand Master. His name was Jacques de Molay. He had become Grand Master around 1292. He had spent years trying to defend the Crusader presence in the East. He had witnessed the final collapse of the Crusader states. He had hoped for another crusade, and now he was imprisoned. For de Molay, the accusations must have seemed almost impossible to understand. The Templars had dedicated themselves to Christianity. Their members had died fighting in the Holy Land. Their castles had fallen. Their order had suffered enormous losses. Yet now they were being accused of betraying the very faith they had defended. De Molay initially defended the order. He denied the accusations. But like many others, he was placed under enormous pressure. At one point, he confessed to certain charges. Later, however, he withdrew his confession. This would become crucial. In medieval church law, retracting a confession could have serious consequences. The Templar case was becoming a political and religious crisis. Philip wanted the order destroyed. The Pope wanted to control the process. The Templars wanted to defend themselves, and across Europe their supporters were watching. The question was no longer simply whether individual knights had committed wrongdoing. The bigger question was whether the entire institution should survive. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars had been one of the most powerful organizations in Europe. They possessed wealth. They possessed property. They possessed influence. And now the French crown was attempting to dismantle them. Philip's motives remain a subject of historical debate. His financial difficulties certainly mattered. He owed money to various creditors. The Templars were wealthy, but it would be too simple to say that money was the only reason for the arrests. There were genuine concerns about the order's reputation. There were accusations from former members. There were political tensions between the French monarchy and the papacy, and the Crusader movement itself had changed. The Templars no longer had the same obvious military purpose they had possessed when Jerusalem and Acre were under Christian control. All these factors created a dangerous environment. The order was vulnerable, and Philip acted. The investigations continued. More prisoners were questioned. More confessions appeared. Some were detailed, others were vague, and gradually, the image of the Knights Templar as an invincible brotherhood began to disappear. The white mantles were replaced by prison clothes. The castles were occupied by royal officials. The estates were seized. The knights waited in cells. Some were elderly. Some were wounded veterans. Some had spent decades serving the order. They had fought in the Holy Land. They had defended castles. They had survived battles. Now they faced accusations that could cost them their lives. But the story was not finished. The Pope eventually summoned leaders of the order. Church investigations continued. And in 1308, the Pope began taking steps to examine the case more independently from the French crown. The Templars were given opportunities to defend themselves. Some did so vigorously. They insisted that the accusations were false. Others remained frightened. The entire process moved slowly. Years passed, and the order's fate remained uncertain. Then in 1312, Pope Clement V made a decision that would change everything. The Knights Templar would be suppressed. The order itself would cease to exist as an official religious institution. Its properties were generally transferred to other military orders, especially the Hospitallers. Although the exact disposition varied by region, the Templars had survived for nearly 2 centuries. Now, their organization was gone, but the fate of their leaders remained unresolved. Jacques de Molay and other senior Templars still faced judgment, and their story would end in a dramatic confrontation with the French crown, a confrontation that would transform Jacques de Molay from a medieval military commander into one of the most famous figures in the legend of the Knights Templar. His final days were approaching, and with them, the end of the order's medieval story. By 1312, the Knights Templar no longer existed as an independent order. The decision had been made. Pope Clement V had formally suppressed the order, bringing an end to nearly 2 centuries of Templar history. But the story of the Templars was not finished. Their properties were being transferred. Their members were being questioned. Their leaders were still facing judgment. And one man in particular remained at the center of the drama, Jacques de Molay. He had once commanded one of the most powerful military orders in Christendom. Now he was an aging prisoner. He had spent much of his life in the service of the Templars. He had traveled through the eastern Mediterranean. He had witnessed the final collapse of the Crusader states. He had hoped that another crusade might restore Christian power in the Holy Land. Instead, he found himself imprisoned in France. The contrast was extraordinary. The Grand Master of the Knights Templar had once been surrounded by knights, castles, ships, and wealth. Now he had almost none of those things. The order that had once stretched across Europe had been dismantled. Its properties were being transferred to other institutions. Its knights had been dispersed, and its name had become associated with accusations of heresy. Yet de Molay continued to defend the Templars. He insisted that the order was not guilty of the crimes being attributed to it. This was especially important because the legal process had been complicated by earlier confessions. Some Templars had confessed. Others had denied the accusations. Some had later withdrawn their confessions. The church had to determine what could actually be trusted. The medieval justice system was very different from the modern one. Interrogation could involve enormous pressure. Torture was sometimes used. Religious accusations could carry tremendous consequences, and political influence could affect the process. The Templar trials therefore unfolded unevenly. Different regions handled former Templars differently. Some were imprisoned for years. Some were eventually released. Some were assigned to religious houses. Others received penances. The fate of individual knights varied considerably. But the organization itself was finished. There would be no restoration of the Templar order, no return to Jerusalem, no reopening of the headquarters at Acre, no new army gathering under the Red Cross. The age of the Knights Templar had ended. And yet, the question of what exactly had happened inside the order remained. For centuries, people would ask whether the Templars had really been guilty. Were they heretics? Were their secret rituals misunderstood? Had some members committed abuses? Were the accusations exaggerated? Or had political and financial interests helped destroy them? Historians continue to examine the surviving evidence. But one thing is clear. The popular image of the Templars as mysterious guardians of an ancient secret is largely the product of later centuries. The medieval Templars were real. Their castles were real. Their wealth was real. Their military campaigns were real. Their political influence was real. Their arrests were real. Their trials were real. But many of the extraordinary stories surrounding them appeared long after the order disappeared. This distinction matters. The Templars were already fascinating without the legends. They had begun as a small brotherhood protecting pilgrims. They became a multinational military organization. They developed a sophisticated financial network. They fought in major crusades. They built enormous castles. They served kings and popes, and eventually they became powerful enough to frighten the very rulers they had once served. Their downfall demonstrated something important about medieval power. No institution was completely protected. Even an organization supported by the church could disappear. Even a wealthy order could lose everything. Even experienced warriors could become prisoners. And even a man as powerful as a Grand Master could find himself helpless before a king. Jacques de Molay's final years became increasingly tragic. He had already lost the order. Now he faced the possibility of death. Philip IV wanted the Templar leadership permanently discredited. The accusations needed to remain convincing. If de Molay and other senior Templars publicly defended themselves successfully, the king's campaign could become much more difficult to justify. So the pressure continued. Eventually, de Molay and another senior Templar, Geoffroy de Charnay, were brought before a gathering in Paris in 1314. There, they again maintained their innocence regarding the most serious accusations. Their statements created a problem. They had previously confessed. Now they were rejecting those confessions. From the perspective of the authorities, this could be treated as a relapse into heresy. The final decision was made quickly. On March 18th, 1314, Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charnay were executed by burning on an island in the Seine in Paris. The exact details of their final moments come from later accounts and should be treated carefully. But their deaths became one of the most famous episodes in Templar history. The Grand Master, who had once represented the Order's power, was now dead. The Knights Templar had vanished as an institution, and Europe moved on, or at least, it seemed to, because the end of the Templars created a vacuum. Their properties had been transferred. Their knights had been scattered. Their castles belonged to others. But their reputation remained. stories about hidden treasure began to circulate. Some legends claimed that the Templars had secretly escaped with enormous wealth. Others suggested that their ships had disappeared before the arrests. Still others claimed that they had carried sacred objects or mysterious documents away from France. But the evidence for these stories is weak. The Templars certainly possessed significant wealth, but there is no solid evidence for the enormous secret treasure described in later legends. Much of the order's property was documented and transferred. Their European estates did not simply vanish. Their valuables were subject to investigation and seizure. Some assets were lost, some were transferred, some may have been hidden or moved during the confusion, but the idea of a vast hidden Templar treasure became much larger over time. And once a mystery exists, people tend to fill the empty spaces with imagination. The same thing happened with the supposed fate of the surviving Templars. Some had been absorbed into other military orders. Some retired. Some entered religious houses. Some returned to ordinary life. In Portugal, the story took a particularly interesting turn. The Portuguese branch of the Templars was reorganized as the Order of Christ in 1319. This allowed some of the Templar tradition and property in Portugal to continue under a new institution. Centuries later, the Order of Christ would become associated with Portuguese exploration, and this connection helped create even more legends about the Templars' survival. But the historical reality was more practical. The Templars had not simply vanished overnight. Their people moved into other institutions. Their property changed hands. Their traditions were absorbed. Their name disappeared. But parts of their legacy remained. The same was true elsewhere in Europe. The Hospitallers received much of the Templar property. Former Templars entered other religious communities. Their estates became farms, monasteries, administrative centers, and military possessions. The physical world of the Templars continued even after the order itself was gone. Castles still stood. Stone walls still rose above the countryside. Old documents remained in archives. And beneath the surface of European history, the memory of the Templars began changing. At first, they were remembered mainly as a controversial religious order. Then, they became mysterious. Their disappearance seemed too dramatic. Their wealth seemed too great. Their rituals seemed too secretive, and their final leader's death seemed almost theatrical. The Templars had become a perfect subject for legend, but before the legends grew, there had been real men. Men who had prayed, men who had fought, men who had traveled thousands of miles, men who had lost friends at Hattin, men who had defended Acre, men who had watched the Crusader states disappear, and men who eventually found themselves prisoners in their own homeland. The Knights Templar had risen from a tiny brotherhood in Jerusalem and ended in prison cells in France. Their story was over, but their legend was only beginning. The Knights Templar were gone. The order that had once stretched from the streets of Jerusalem to the castles of France had disappeared as an official institution. Its knights had been scattered. Its properties had changed hands. Its leaders were dead or imprisoned. And yet, the name of the Templars refused to disappear. In the centuries that followed, people began asking questions. What had happened to their treasure? Did some Templars escape? Were there secret documents? Had the order discovered something in Jerusalem? Had they possessed forbidden knowledge? And perhaps most intriguingly, did the Knights Templar somehow survive? These questions would create one of history's most enduring legends. But before we follow the legends, it is worth returning to what actually happened. After the suppression of the order in 1312, most former Templars did not disappear mysteriously. Many were absorbed into other religious institutions. Some entered monasteries. Some joined the Hospitallers. Some returned to ordinary life. Others continued living on properties that had once belonged to the Templars. In Portugal, the story took a particularly interesting path. The Portuguese Templars were reorganized into the Order of Christ. This new order inherited much of the former Templar property in Portugal. Its members continued a military and religious tradition that had connections to the old order. Over time, the Order of Christ became closely connected with Portuguese exploration. Centuries later, Portuguese ships would sail into the Atlantic and beyond. And because of this connection, a new legend began to develop. Some people wondered whether the Templars had secretly passed their knowledge and wealth into the age of exploration. The famous Red Cross associated with the Order of Christ appeared on Portuguese ships. This encouraged speculation, but the historical reality was less mysterious. The Order of Christ was a new institution recognized by the Portuguese crown and the church. It inherited Templar properties and some traditions. That did not prove that a secret Templar organization had survived underground. Still, the possibility was irresistible to later storytellers. The same thing happened with Scotland. One popular legend claims that Templars fleeing persecution reached Scotland and fought beside Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. The story is dramatic: knights fleeing France, crossing the sea, arriving in Scotland, and helping defeat the English. But there is no reliable contemporary evidence proving that a large force of Templars fought at Bannockburn. The story became popular much later. It is an example of how the Templars gradually moved from documented history into legend, and the legends kept growing. One of the most famous involved the Holy Grail. Some later stories claimed that the Templars had discovered or protected the Grail. Others connected them with the Ark of the Covenant. Still others claimed that they had found secret religious knowledge beneath the Temple Mount. But there is no solid historical evidence that the Templars possessed these objects. Their original headquarters had been near the Temple Mount. That fact is real. Their name was connected to the Temple of Solomon. That is also real. But later generations transformed these facts into increasingly elaborate stories. The temple became a symbol. The Templars became guardians of mysteries, and the missing pieces of their history became spaces where imagination could grow. Their supposed treasure became one of the greatest examples. The Templars had certainly been wealthy. Their estates stretched across Europe. They managed large amounts of money. They transported valuables. They possessed castles and ships. So it was reasonable for people to wonder what happened to their wealth after the arrests. Some property was confiscated. Some was transferred to the Hospitallers. Some was returned to donors or handled according to regional laws. Some assets were undoubtedly lost. And some Templar possessions may never have been fully accounted for. But this is very different from the idea of an enormous secret treasure disappearing without a trace. There is no convincing evidence of a gigantic hidden Templar fortune waiting beneath an ancient castle, yet the mystery remained. And mysteries attract treasure hunters. Over the centuries, people searched churches, castles, caves, islands, and old ruins. They looked for secret tunnels. They studied medieval maps. They examined ancient symbols. They searched for hidden chambers. The Templars became part of European folklore. Their red cross appeared in stories about buried gold. Their castles became locations for legends. Their final Grand Master became a tragic figure. And the story of their destruction became a warning about the dangers of wealth and political power. Then came another transformation. During the 18th and 19th centuries, European writers became fascinated with secret societies. Freemasonry was sometimes linked with Templar imagery. Various organizations adopted the name or symbolism of the medieval order, but these later groups were not the same as the original Knights Templar. The medieval order had disappeared centuries earlier. Still, the association helped keep the Templars alive in popular imagination. Books were written, novels were published, paintings portrayed mysterious knights, ancient castles were connected to secret rituals, and eventually, the Templars entered modern popular culture. Films, television programs, novels, games, and documentaries continued expanding the mythology. The real Templars became increasingly difficult to separate from the fictional ones. In popular stories, they were sometimes portrayed as guardians of supernatural secrets, sometimes as villains, sometimes as noble heroes, sometimes as secret rulers manipulating governments from the shadows. None of these simple images fully represents the historical order. The real Templars were more complicated. They were religious men living under strict rules. They were soldiers who fought brutal wars. They were administrators who managed enormous estates. They were financial agents trusted by powerful people. They were political actors. And they were human beings capable of mistakes, ambition, courage, fear, and failure. Their history was neither entirely heroic nor entirely sinister. It was medieval. And the medieval world was complicated. Perhaps that is why the Templars remain fascinating. Their story contains almost everything that captures the imagination: war, religion, money, castles, kings, prisoners, trials, executions, lost cities, ancient ruins, and unanswered questions. But the greatest mystery may not be what secret the Templars supposedly discovered. It may be how such a powerful organization disappeared so completely. For nearly 2 centuries, they seemed permanent. Then, within a few years, they were gone. Their castles belonged to others. Their wealth was redistributed. Their knights were scattered. Their Grand Master was dead. And the order's name survived mainly in documents and memory. Yet their physical legacy remained. Across Europe and the Mediterranean, former Templar buildings still stand. Some have been transformed into churches. Others became castles, museums, ruins, or private properties. Their architecture provides evidence of the enormous organization that once existed. Stone is often more reliable than legend. A castle does not tell us that the Templars possessed magical secrets, but it can tell us something real. They had resources, they had engineers, they had soldiers, they had land, and they had the ability to organize across enormous distances. Their financial records also reveal something important. The Templars were not simply treasure hunters. They were administrators. They created systems. They maintained networks. They moved resources efficiently. Their success was based partly on organization rather than mystery. And perhaps that makes their rise even more impressive. They began with a handful of knights in Jerusalem. They became an international institution. They survived the loss of Jerusalem. They survived the fall of Acre. They survived generations of warfare. And then they were destroyed by political forces within Europe. Their story demonstrates how quickly power can change. A group can become indispensable, then dangerous, then vulnerable, then forgotten. But the Templars were never completely forgotten. Their story survived because people continued asking questions. What happened to the surviving knights? Where did the wealth go? Was anything hidden? Did the order leave behind secrets? The evidence gives us some answers, but not all. And where evidence ends, legend begins. That is why the Knights Templar continue to fascinate us after more than 7 centuries. They were real. Their castles were real. Their battles were real. Their wealth was real. Their destruction was real. but the mystery surrounding them belongs partly to the centuries that came afterward. The Templars had already disappeared. The world had moved on, yet their legend was just beginning to grow. And in the next chapter of our journey, we will look beyond the myths and return to the final legacy of the Knights Templar, because their greatest contribution to history may not have been a hidden treasure at all, but the remarkable world they helped create. The Knights Templar had disappeared centuries ago, yet their influence had not. Their castles remained scattered across Europe and the Mediterranean. Their documents survived in archives. Their symbols appeared on old buildings, and their name continued to inspire stories. But if we step away from the legends, what did the Templars actually leave behind? Perhaps the first thing to remember is that they were not simply warriors. They were organizers. They developed a network capable of moving people, money, food, horses, weapons, and information across enormous distances. For a medieval institution, this was extraordinary. A Templar house in France could support operations thousands of miles away. A farm could produce food for the order. A wealthy donor could provide money. A ship could transport supplies across the Mediterranean. And a castle could protect an important road. All of these pieces were connected. The Templars had created a system. That system was one of the reasons they became so powerful. Their financial activities are particularly interesting. They did not invent modern banking, but they provided financial services that were extremely useful in medieval Europe. Travelers could deposit money. The order could transfer funds. Merchants and nobles could rely on their network. Kings could use Templar financial expertise. This required trust, and trust was one of the Templars' greatest assets. For generations, people believed that the order would protect their property. The Templars had religious vows. They had strict internal discipline, and their international organization gave them access to resources that ordinary individuals did not possess. Their financial network therefore became almost as important as their military network. But there was another legacy: architecture. The Templars built and occupied castles across the Crusader states. These fortifications reflected the military knowledge accumulated through generations of warfare. Their walls were thick. Their towers were carefully positioned. Their storage areas were designed to withstand sieges. Water supplies were protected. Weapons were stored. Horses were kept ready. Some castles stood on dramatic mountains. Others guarded roads or ports. These structures were not merely symbols. They were practical machines of war. They existed because the Templars understood that the survival of the Crusader states depended upon defensive infrastructure. And their castles also tell us something about the people who built them. Thousands of workers were involved: stonecutters, carpenters, blacksmiths, engineers, farmers, merchants, transport workers. The Templars were only one part of a much larger society. Their story cannot be separated from the people who supported them. This is another reason the history of the Templars is more complicated than legend suggests. They did not operate alone. They depended upon European agriculture. They depended upon merchants. They depended upon ports. They depended upon ships. They depended upon local communities. And they depended upon political relationships. Without that wider network, the Templars could never have become powerful. Their legacy, therefore, belongs to the broader history of medieval Europe and the Mediterranean. It belongs to the Crusades. It belongs to the history of religious warfare. It belongs to the development of international trade. And it belongs to the changing relationship between religious institutions and political power. The Templars also left an important lesson about military organization. Their knights were trained to operate within disciplined formations. They were expected to obey commanders. They could not simply chase an enemy because they wanted glory. This discipline was particularly valuable in battles where enemy forces used fast cavalry and missile attacks. The Templars learned to fight in a world where heavy cavalry alone was not enough. They needed coordination. They needed intelligence. They needed supply lines. They needed fortifications. And they needed patience. Their military history, therefore, reflects the gradual evolution of medieval warfare. But perhaps the most important part of their legacy is what happened after they disappeared. The fall of the Templars demonstrated how political power could destroy even an institution that appeared almost untouchable. For generations, the order had enjoyed privileges granted by popes and kings. Its wealth seemed secure. Its properties were protected. Its knights were respected. Yet in 1307, everything changed. The French crown moved against them. Their political protection failed. Their leaders were imprisoned. Their property was seized. And the order itself was eventually suppressed. The lesson was clear. Power depends upon relationships. The Templars had spent centuries building relationships with rulers, but those relationships could change. A king who once valued the order could eventually see it as a threat. A religious institution that once protected the Templars could eventually decide that preserving peace was more important than preserving the order. And an organization that had survived countless enemies could be destroyed by political circumstances. This is perhaps the most human part of their story. The Templars were not destroyed because they suddenly became weak soldiers. They were destroyed because the world around them changed. Their original purpose had become uncertain. The Crusader states were gone. European politics had changed. The papacy was under pressure. The French monarchy was becoming stronger. And the Templars had accumulated extraordinary wealth. Their strength had created vulnerability. This pattern appears throughout history. An institution grows, it becomes successful, its influence expands. Eventually, its very success attracts enemies. The Templars were no exception. And then there is their most enduring legacy, their mystery. Why do people still talk about them? Partly because their story has an unusually dramatic ending. Imagine an organization existing for almost 200 years. Imagine it fighting across the Mediterranean. Imagine it controlling castles and estates. Then imagine its leaders being arrested almost simultaneously across an entire kingdom. It is the kind of ending that naturally creates questions. What did they know? What did they possess? What did they hide? What happened to their treasure? The historical answers are often less dramatic than the legends, but perhaps that makes the truth more interesting. The Templars were not supernatural guardians. They were not immortal secret rulers. They were not a hidden organization controlling Europe from underground. They were medieval men operating within a complicated political and religious world. They made mistakes. They experienced defeats, they disagreed, they suffered, they adapted, and eventually they disappeared. Their surviving property was redistributed, their members entered other institutions. Their traditions were partly absorbed, their castles continued to be used, their documents became historical records, and their name became a legend. The transformation from history to mythology happened slowly. Each generation added something: a story about hidden treasure, a rumor about secret knowledge, a tale about a mysterious escape, a supposed connection to another secret society. Over time, the real Templars became almost impossible to separate from the imaginary ones. But beneath the myths, the original story remains powerful. A small group of knights in Jerusalem, a religious mission, the rise of a military order, the capture and defense of castles, the wealth of Europe, the Crusades, the fall of Jerusalem, the struggle against Saladin, the loss of Acre, the collapse of the Crusader states, the arrests of 1307, the trials, the execution of Jacques de Molay, and, finally, silence. The Templars had once imagined that their mission might last forever. History had other plans, yet perhaps their greatest legacy is not the mystery surrounding their disappearance. It is the evidence of what people can build when organization, belief, wealth, and political opportunity come together. The Templars became powerful because medieval Europe created the conditions for them to become powerful. And they disappeared because those conditions eventually changed. Their story is therefore not simply about knights. It is about institutions. It is about ambition. It is about faith. It is about war. And it is about the fragile nature of power. More than 700 years after their suppression, their castles still stand. Their symbols still appear on ancient stones. Their documents still sit in archives. And their name still echoes through history. The Knights Templar are gone, but their story remains. And perhaps that is the final paradox. The order itself disappeared, yet its memory became almost impossible to destroy. The story of the Knights Templar began with a simple idea: protect the pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. A handful of knights gathered around Hugues de Payan, committed themselves to religious life, and entered a world where faith and warfare were deeply connected. They could never have imagined what that small beginning would become. The Templars grew, they received land, they built commanderies, they gathered wealth, they developed a sophisticated network across Europe and the Mediterranean. Their knights fought in the Holy Land. Their castles became symbols of Crusader power, and their red cross became one of the most recognizable symbols of medieval warfare. For nearly 2 centuries, they remained part of the great struggle surrounding Jerusalem. They fought at Hattin. They witnessed the fall of Jerusalem. They fought alongside Richard the Lionheart. They helped defend Acre. And when Acre finally fell in 1291, the world that had created them was almost gone. The Templars survived, but their original purpose had been broken. There was no longer a Crusader kingdom like the one they had once defended. Jerusalem was under Muslim control. Acre was gone. The great castles of the Crusader states were falling one after another. The Templars moved their attention toward Europe, and there, they discovered that the greatest threat to their survival would not come from a battlefield. It would come from politics. King Philip IV of France wanted greater control. He needed money. The Templars possessed enormous wealth. Their independence made them difficult to control, and their reputation made them powerful. Then came October 13th, 1307. Templars across France were arrested. The accusations were shocking: heresy, denial of Christ, secret rituals, strange ceremonies, and other alleged crimes. Some Templars confessed, some denied everything. Some later withdrew their confessions. The use of torture made the evidence deeply controversial. The order's leaders were imprisoned. Its properties were seized. Its reputation collapsed. And after years of investigation, the Knights Templar were officially suppressed. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, continued to defend the order. In 1314, he was executed in Paris. With his death, the medieval Knights Templar had effectively reached their end. But history rarely ends as neatly as a final execution. The Templars left behind castles. They left behind documents. They left behind wealth that was redistributed. They left behind former members who entered other religious institutions. And they left behind questions. Those questions became the foundation of one of history's greatest legends. What happened to the Templar treasure? Did some knights escape? Did they hide secret knowledge? Did they discover something beneath the Temple Mount? Did they carry mysterious objects away from Jerusalem? Did the order survive in secret? The evidence does not support many of these stories. But legends do not require certainty. They require possibility. And the Templars had plenty of mystery surrounding them. Their ceremonies were private. Their organization was international. Their wealth was enormous. Their destruction was sudden. Their final Grand Master died dramatically, and their castles remained standing long after their owners were gone. It was almost inevitable that stories would grow. Over the centuries, writers connected the Templars with the Holy Grail, with hidden treasure, with secret societies, with mysterious symbols, with Scotland, with Portugal, with ancient religious traditions. Some of these stories are fascinating, but they belong to the history of the Templar legend, not necessarily to the history of the medieval order itself. The real Templars were already remarkable enough. They were men living under strict religious rules. They were soldiers. They were administrators. They were landowners. They were financial agents. They were diplomats. They were prisoners. They were sometimes heroes. They were sometimes participants in brutal warfare. And above all, they were human beings living in a complicated age. Their story reminds us that history is rarely divided neatly into heroes and villains. The Crusades themselves were complicated. The medieval world was complicated. The Templars were complicated. Their faith inspired extraordinary sacrifice. Their military role contributed to violence. Their wealth allowed them to build and defend. That same wealth eventually made them vulnerable. Their independence protected them. That same independence eventually frightened powerful rulers. Their reputation made them influential. That reputation also made the accusations against them more dramatic. In the end, the Templars were destroyed not by a single battlefield defeat. They were destroyed by a combination of political pressure, financial interest, changing circumstances, and the loss of the world in which they had originally been created. That may be the most important lesson of their story. Institutions can seem permanent, but nothing in history is truly permanent. The Roman Empire seemed permanent. Medieval kingdoms seemed permanent. Great castles seemed permanent. And for almost 200 years, the Knights Templar seemed permanent too. But history changes. Jerusalem changed hands. Crusader states disappeared. Kings gained power. Popes lost influence. New military powers rose. Old institutions disappeared. And the Templars became memory. Yet their memory survived. It survived in stone. It survived in manuscripts. It survived in church records. It survived in the ruins of castles standing beneath the Mediterranean sun. And it survived in stories told centuries after the last Templar had disappeared. Perhaps that is why their story still feels so mysterious. We know how the order began. We know much about how it operated. We know how it fought. We know how it became wealthy. We know how it was arrested. We know how it was suppressed. And we know how Jacques de Molay died. But there are still gaps. And those gaps invite imagination. Maybe there is something poetic about that. The Templars spent their existence guarding sacred places, defending castles, and protecting roads. Then when their own order disappeared, they became a kind of historical ruin themselves, a monument to a vanished world, a reminder of an age when knights could cross continents in the name of faith, when castles controlled entire regions, when kings and popes competed for authority, when the road to Jerusalem could determine the fate of kingdoms. The Knights Templar belong to that world. They do not belong to ours. And yet, their story continues to speak to us, not because they possessed magical secrets, not because they secretly rule the modern world, not because their treasure is waiting to be discovered, but because their rise and fall reveal something timeless. Power can be built slowly and lost quickly. Reputation can protect an institution to capture and destroy it. Faith can inspire courage and justify conflict. Wealth can create independence and attract enemies. And memory can outlive everything. The Templars themselves are gone. The men who wore the white mantle have been gone for more than 7 centuries. The horses have fallen silent. The castles have weathered countless winters. The banners have disappeared. The Crusader armies are gone. Jerusalem has changed many times. The world that created the Knights Templar has vanished. but their story remains. So when you hear the name Knights Templar, remember the real men behind the legend. Remember the young knights who first arrived in Jerusalem. Remember the pilgrims traveling dangerous roads. Remember the castles rising from the hills. Remember Hattin. Remember Acre. Remember the loss of Jerusalem. Remember the long centuries of warfare. Remember the wealth and power. Remember the arrests of 1307. Remember the prisoners. Remember Jacques de Molay. And remember how quickly an institution that seemed eternal could disappear. Perhaps somewhere, beneath the moonlight, an old Templar castle still stands. Its stones are quiet. Its walls no longer protect soldiers. No banners fly above its towers. No knights wait beside its gates. Only wind moves through the empty corridors. And if those stones could speak, they might tell us that history is not really about legends. It is about people. People who believed, people who fought, people who built, people who lost, people who hoped, and people who eventually became part of the past. The Knights Templar began with a handful of men and a dangerous road to Jerusalem. They rose into one of the most powerful organizations of medieval Europe. And they disappeared almost as suddenly as they had risen. But their final legacy was something they could never have planned. Their story became immortal, not because they conquered the world, but because the world never stopped wondering about them. And perhaps that is where we should leave them, not beneath a secret vault, not beside a chest of hidden gold, not in some mysterious underground chamber, but among the ruins of history where the truth and the legend meet. The Knights Templar are gone. Their age is gone, but their story still whispers.